Hello and welcome back to the News Items Podcast. I'm John Ellis. I am the founder and editor of two Substack newsletters. One is called News Items. The other is called Political News Items, and you can find them both at news-items.com. My guests today are Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan. They are the authors of a fantastic new book called Regime Change: Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump. How they got this book out is a mystery to me. So my first question is, are you both married still, or did this cause the end, so to speak?
John, you're touching on a far more sensitive nerve than you might even imagine. So we are both still married to our respective partners. But
correct. But they're not. They're very happy to have this done.
It was not beloved in my household.
The process was certainly not beloved in mine. Okay. The book itself is beloved, but not the process.
How long did it take to do? I mean, obviously the reporting was ongoing. Maggie, you told me that you had a book contract almost immediately after Trump was elected. You obviously split the reportorial duties, but when you actually sat down to do the book, you both had book leave from the New York Times. How long did it take from point A to publication by Simon & Schuster?
I don't think we can completely quantify it. The book contract was actually signed in 2023 because we both, Jonathan came to the Times in January, and he had been a very difficult human to compete against. And I was very happy that he came here. He's also a fantastic collaborator and colleague and an immense talent. But we realized that we were covering, envisioning this as the last act of Trump, whether that was court cases that were going to end potentially with a prison sentence, which was in fact a real possibility at the time, or whether it was going to be him back in the White House, but that we had something that we could tell a unique story about and provide unique reporting on. And then by the time we got into the first year of the term, the volume of activity was so huge from the administration that it became very clear to us early on that we were covering something vastly different than even than the Trump handoff to Biden in 2020. This was just a fundamental sea change of what a U.S. presidency looks like, which is why the title is what it is in terms of regime change. But we had to jettison like 99% of our reporting. And we started the writing. God, I don't even remember exactly when we started the writing. We started the writing, I think, fairly early last year, Jonathan. Am I right about that?
I would say for real, it kind of was like June last year when we really started the writing. Right. Basically, we've got thousands of pages of reported scenes and things that we have that is on the cutting room floor. And we were reporting and writing somewhat in real time for about a year and a half before we started the actual writing of the book in earnest. I took 10 months off from the Times. Maggie took 5.5 off.
Yeah, 5.5.
We took a lot of time off for at a very, high stakes moment. So the Times was very good with us.
Quite.
Very supportive.
So Trump was elected in 2024, obviously, with 49.8% of the vote, had 230,000 votes gone the other way in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Kamala Harris would have received 270 elector votes and would have been elected president of the United States. Trump describes this as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, landslide in American political history. Does he believe that, or is that just a way of positioning himself as more powerful than he in fact might be?
I don't know how to quantify whether he believes it or not. I think there's a very long history of him saying everything that he does at which he succeeds, or frankly, even the things he doesn't, are a massive success. And so the salesman aspect is key. He had this line in the 90s when he was giving someone a tour of Mar-a-Lago, and he was saying something like we won a competition for the best doors or something like that. And he said to the person, the phrase the best is very important to me. And that, you see that play out on a number of fronts. What I do think it is him underlining the fact that, look, he was the first Republican to win the popular vote in 20 years. And so I think it was just underscoring how legitimate this win was. His his last one was too in 2016, but he did not win the popular vote, and it was under a cloud of investigations. So that's always been how I interpret that.
And there was a document that was prepared by, I think, the American First Policy Institute, and I think the Heritage Foundation had a similar document that sort of sketched out what Trump would do with this mandate. How much has that been followed by the administration? Has that really framed what they've been up to, or is that something that, changed as things went along?
Mostly, I think you're probably referring to Project 2025, which was the heritage effort. The American First Policy, had a bunch of stuff. Look, American First Policy ended up being much more involved in the transition than Heritage, because Project 2025 became so politically toxic during 2024 that the Trump people sort of distanced themselves from them. In reality, a lot of the people who were involved at different levels in Project 2025 ended up going into the administration. Russ Vought is the most prominent example, going in as budget director. He was a very central figure in Project 2025. Look, a bunch of Project 2025 policy ended up becoming administration policy, but I don't think that's so much because they sat down and said, well, this is our blueprint. It was more of a menu of things that, people agreed with or didn't agree with, picked and choose. And, you see some AFP ideas come through, but it didn't end up being this sort of guiding light. And certainly when it comes to issues that Trump himself cares about, like trade and foreign policy, those efforts are completely irrelevant, couldn't be more irrelevant, have had no bearing whatsoever on anything that Trump has done. There may be areas where they intersect, but not because anyone's following a blueprint.
There's also a whole downstream list of items that Trump, at least I think to the best of our knowledge, isn't especially interested in, doesn't pay much attention to. A lot of it is intricate agency policy. And that is the kind of thing that Russ Vought is very interested in, or Stephen Miller is very interested in. And so those things may be going on, but it's not because Trump is saying, get that done.
That's a great thing at I guess, the last chapter of your book, where you're meeting with him to fact check and sort of finish up your research. And Trump says he's off to sign some executive orders that he has no idea.
Not even sure what I'm signing. Yeah.
The thing that surprises me is that the administration is incredibly active on any number of fronts. You have the president incredibly active on social media, watching TV, talking to people about what's going on in the official business, and meeting people, the 5-minute photo op kind of thing. How much does Trump know about what the administration is doing?
It's a good question. And I think that it depends on what the issue is. One of the things that we talk about in the book is how the immense power of Stephen Miller as Trump's top domestic policy advisor is not properly understood, but it's certainly seen throughout any number of actions. One of the things that was very striking about the whole Signalgate controversy, where they were discussing the battle plans in a Signal chat group, was that Stephen Miller was the final word that everybody heard from. The president wants this, and we move forward. And Stephen is very involved in a number of matters. Part of how he succeeds is he will say, he speaks as if he has the president's authority in conversations, not with Trump. The president wants this. The president says he wants this. And his statements on those things are very rarely challenged. So does Trump know everything that is happening? Almost certainly not. For instance, I'll give you an example in the book. We described Stephen Miller being quite surprised to learn that Kristi Noem at DHS was requisitioning a bunch of warehouses that were going to be morphed into detention centers for migrants. And he thought that was an incredibly stupid use of money and of time. There's no chance that Trump knew about that. Or I shouldn't say no, but it's extremely unlikely. But on major items like trade policy, like sanctions, you can go down the list. They won't make a move unless he's consulted. So it just depends on the issue.
There are whole vast areas of the federal government in which he has zero interest and couldn't tell you. There are whole departments and agencies that he has never learned what they do or paid any attention to. He spends zero time thinking about the activities of HUD, of housing and urban development, of transportation, of health and human services. Nobody spent less time thinking about healthcare policy than Donald Trump. So there are whole areas of the government, EPA, where the secretaries are completely autonomous. He sort of gives them a attaboy pat on the back if he sees a segment on Fox that gives them good press, great job. I remember talking to one cabinet secretary in the first term, and they told me that Trump's marching orders to them when they took over this agency, an agency he cares nothing about to this day, and Trump's instructions was, just win. I just want you to go and win. And so they interpreted that to mean, I'm just going to do whatever I think is right until I hear otherwise. And they basically never heard from him. I mean, very rarely. He would talk to them at a cabinet meeting or whatever, but that's still the case.
And to the extent that he pays attention to something like I would just add one thing, to HHS or, the EPA, it's because he has, oil executives or industry,
Right.
Energy executives coming in to meet with him. And HHS, it's because of this synergy that he has with RFK Jr. and this interest in what he does. And Trump is, has been a vaccine skeptic for a very long time. But, Trump, it just depends on the issue. In term one, he was interested in HHS so much as it related to like vaping policy. But it's on very, very discrete issues. I don't think he would even be thinking about the Department of Labor were it not for the fact that there's a scandal involving the head of it.
I think he was complaining recently about how boring it was when Mehmet Oz was trying to describe to him Medicare policy on a plane flight. So yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Like when the pharma executives come in, it's usually when someone complains about something or there's bad press, for sure.
Exactly.
Generally speaking,
no.
Yeah.
One of the things that top business executives have said repeatedly, a number of them has said anyway, that the great thing about the Trump administration is that you can get things done quickly. You can go to the administration, and if you have an issue, if you have a problem with that government agency, it can get resolved very quickly. And they've been, they were constantly complaining about Biden.
Right.
Is that true? I
Yes.
mean, is that you can get things done quickly if you're a significant business operation?
I mean, there's no question. There's no question that we have a pretty extraordinary scene in the book where you have big CEOs of the big oil companies, energy companies in the cabinet room. Was it the cabinet room or the Roosevelt room? I think it was the cabinet room. Anyway, we're talking about Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, whatever. And it's like a fun house in there. They're just complaining about regulations and Trump's just like, we'll get rid of it. Stephen Miller at the table is live texting with Pam Bondi, the Attorney General. Well, we'll do this, we'll do that. Complain about the European Union. Trump's like, Howard, we'll tariff them, put 20%. And it was this sort of like, there was no policy process. It was just direct to him. And he's like, yes, instinctively get it done. And one of them who was in the room, I spoke to them afterwards and they said they've dealt with many presidents and they've never seen a president who has such a feel for his executive power. And they said, I would never want a Democrat to have this sort of grasp of executive power, but this guy does. And, it's good for us kind of thing. If you hire the right lobbyist, if you don't even need to hire lobbyists anymore. You can actually just go into business with the Trump family.
That's right.
You can get a lot of business done at a very high clip in this administration, no question.
Well, and it's one of the things, just to add one more piece to that, the remarkable thing about Stephen Miller's texting with Pam Bondi is, Stephen Miller says in that meeting when the president is directing this, I'm on it. And that is the whole approach. One of the things that we detail in the book is how Miller and Trump disdains government process for a variety of reasons, one of which is that he was a developer and he can't stand it. Miller dislikes agency processes because they often stymie the power that the executive branch can have or the decision-making that can be done quickly. And so one of the most illustrative and instructive episodes for them was imposing Title 42 as a health emergency during the pandemic in 2020. It sealed the border, and everything once they came back in power was, not everything, but a lot of things were emergencies. A tariff emergency, a fentanyl emergency. Things were invasions. And Miller would say to people that it wasn't just that you unlocked extraordinarily sweeping powers, but it was the speed, to your question, John.
But I've talked to senior executives at different major companies who had previously served in either the Bush administration or the Obama administration, and they've told me they've had to basically unlearn everything they understand about White House policy, about what they understand about the policy process. And in some cases, they've just recommended to their CEO, just call Trump himself, or just get a meeting with him at Mar-a-Lago or text him. And that if you're one of the big CEOs, you don't even need to be that big a CEO. He'll take calls from really anyone. So you can circumvent a lot. I mean, I'm going on a tangent here, but just for us to get an interview with Donald Trump, if it was up to his staff, we wouldn't have had the interview. They were not helping us get an interview. Let me just tell you.
That is an understatement.
An understatement.
What was happening?
I can't believe that.
There was very much a locked door there so we just called Trump and he made it happen. He ordered the interview to be set up. So there's the corporate version of that as well.
I just want to make clear we had to call more than once. He took a bit of nudging as well.
So I have two, I think, non-serious questions, but they urgently need to be answered. One is,
this could be terrible. I'm waiting.
Maggie wrote about this in Confidence Man, which is her first book on Mr. Trump, which was a meeting in the White House in which Rupert Murdoch brought down a senior Goldman Sachs executive to, I guess, audition, or at least in Rupert's mind, have him audition to be the next chief of staff. And your description is basically, not dozens, but number of people sort of walking in and out and, looking at their phones, and maybe 10, 12 people in there for a meeting that particular Goldman Sachs executive thought would be Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump, and himself. Is that continued? Is that sort of chaos in the Oval Office? Everybody walking in and, sort of looking at what's on Trump's desk. Is that still the standard operating procedure?
I think it's accelerated. In fact, we describe in the book what an average. I mean, there were efforts in term one. That moment came for your listeners. That was I don't think that particular executive really wanted to be the chief of staff, but it was after.
He did not.
Right. It was after Reince Priebus was about to be getting his swan song in the summer of 2017, Trump's first chief of staff. And Priebus had tried imposing order on Trump. He had tried imposing a schedule because, as you know well, John, a president's most valuable commodity is their time. And they were looking for somebody. They, by the way, when I say they, it was, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump were looking for somebody who they thought could manage this. And I think Murdoch was somebody who they were speaking to. They ended up settling on John Kelly, who had a terrible relationship with Trump, was a retired general who monitored his calls, who wanted to set very strict controls on who could come in and talk to Trump. And it backfired spectacularly because Trump got really angry about that. And then you had two subsequent chiefs of staff. Susie Wiles, his current chief of staff, doesn't function that way. And we say in the book, it's her aim is not to try to control him. And she, I suspect, sees no utility in trying to do that. So what you do have is more of these kind of collapsing meetings where one rolls into another, and you've got, we describe we talked to somebody who is describing being in a meeting in the Oval Office, a highly sensitive classified briefing. And in comes the guy with the stones for the paving over the rose garden. And it's like he's got walk-in privileges. And so it's just much more of a flattened experience. But it's very much reflective of the person who's in the Oval Office.
At the same time, so there's this sort of rolling, sometimes it can almost be like a circus-like atmosphere. You've got, pro wrestlers strolling in, people, crypto bros, whatever. But when it comes to stuff that they really do want to keep quiet.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're actually, it's completely different. It's a tiny circle. They do not share information with the rest of the government. We show in our reporting on the lead up to the Iran war that the two officials who would be charged with having to manage the biggest global oil shock in history, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Chris Wright, the Energy Secretary, they were not in the room. They were not in the meetings that led up to the Iran war, the planning meetings. Neither was the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. So they were not brought into the loop until the war began. So when they really do want to keep stuff quiet, they're actually very, very good at it. But there are also huge downsides to that.
A less substantive question, but we do have to talk about the human printer.
Natalie Hart. Yeah.
The question is, who is she and how does she possibly survive? I'm curious because it would seem to me that there are a lot of people in the White House who would want her no longer there, and Susie Wiles seems to be one of those people. So given her position as chief of staff, I guess, she gave up trying to get rid of her, but it seems to me remarkable that she was able to do that given Ms. Wiles' discomfort with her role.
She survives for the same reason that Boris Epstein on the outside survives.
Boris Epstein.
Who is Trump's personal lawyer,
top legal advisor
on the phone to him constantly. Many people, to be very understated about it, are not fans of Mr. Epstein in Trump's orbit. But he survives. In fact, Trump's White House counsel wrote a report, which we report on in the group, a confidential report, or what's the official term for it? I don't know, Maggie, a memo.
It was a review. It was a review. It was an informal review.
Right.
Yeah.
But basically warning Trump that, Boris should not be in his employment and that there'd be risks of indictments and all kinds of exposure. And Trump completely ignored it. And Boris is more powerful than ever right now. Trump is the only one who matters, and he likes having Natalie Harp around. She's a young woman who used to be a host on OAN, a far-right television network.
In term one.
And then when Trump left office, she went and joined him and worked for him. She became known as the human printer because she lugs around in her backpack a portable printer. And particularly in Trump's darkest days, sort of after he left office, when he was at a very low point, she would constantly print out and show him positive news stories that would boost his mood. She would follow him around on the golf course.
Sometimes literally running.
We had photos and things of her like on foot. For some reason, she couldn't get a cart, so she was running.
They weren't affording her seats at that point.
Right.
She moved up later,
running after him. And we also obtained in the book letters that she'd written for Trump that were left in some of his personal spaces, very personal letters that said things like, direct quote, "You are all that matters to me." Very devoted, just idolizes him. Trump has said to people, his staff, "You're all going to go off and make money, but Natalie, she's the only one who really loves me. She'll be here, when you guys are all left me." She sits on the wall in the Oval Office through basically every meeting with her laptop open. And we have a scene in the book that's very illustrative of her role as a conduit of self-affirming information for Trump, or affirming things he already believes. They're in a tariff meeting before Liberation Day, and Trump is pissed. And Howard Lutnick is in front of him across the desk. And Trump says, "Howard, you keep giving me these bullshit numbers. Give me the real numbers on how much India and China are tariffing us. This is bullshit." And Howard says, "These are the real numbers. This is the numbers from USTR." And Trump says, "Natalie, Google, do your Google thing. Get your computer. Tell me the real numbers." Of course, Natalie Harp is Googling, and of course, there are no real numbers. The real numbers are the USTR numbers. But that's a great example. She's basically a conduit for information that Trump wants to seek out himself that will affirm whatever he believes. Or if there are people on the outside that want to get around, what it's like in a White House. Typically, there should be some sort of vetting for paper that reaches the president. That doesn't exist in this White House because Natalie will just give it straight to Trump. And so it's sort of a pipeline of gateway pundit stories and rumors and just whatever, but stuff that will not be vetted by the chief of staff.
Yeah, when George W. Bush was president and Harriet Mears was his legal counsel, everything had to go through her. Literally everything.
Yeah. No, this is a little different.
It's a little bit different. So, great part of, there are many great parts, but one of the great parts is Liberation Day. Trump's obsession with tariffs goes back long before he was president, longer, I think, even, Maggie and I can remember interviews he gave to various publications decades ago about tariffs and how great they are. So can you set the scene for the listeners as to that day? When he announced it, and then the immediate reaction, and then his reaction to the reaction.
It's hard for me to summarize because it was so chaotic, and we lay that out in the book. For a policy of this magnitude and this gravity, starting a trade war with the whole world, you would imagine there would be a pretty rigorous policy process, pretty rigorous analysis. Not the case. There was a rolling series of meetings in the Oval Office where Trump was not really sure about what kind of a formula he wanted for the tariffs. He was devising some kind of formula in his mind. They had some discussion about color coding and different tiers of tariffs. Ultimately, Trump decided that was too complicated. And they only settled on the formula the night before the announcement, the night before. So the formula that you saw wheeled out in the Rose Garden on those foam boards, that was decided the night before. And it was a Peter Navarro idea. of this tariff formula with a little bit of help from the Council of Economic Advisors. Howard Lutnick told people he didn't agree with Peter Navarro's formula because, quote, he graduated from the 9th grade. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, when people would sort of sarcastically say to him, Happy Liberation Day, he said Happy Libation Day, more like Happy Libation Day. It was a very difficult period for them because Trump was just going by pure gut. This was not something that was rooted in deep analysis. And by the way, you had people like Bessent and Lutnick who were sort of deputized to deal with foreign governments in the weeks before. And they couldn't give the governments any clarity because they didn't know. Trump didn't. So how can you tell them, well, you should expect this tariff rate or this one when the person in charge had no earthly idea what he was going to do? So that was the way it played out. And then what we lay out in the book, it actually became even more fraught after Liberation Day because you had these very alarming signals coming from the bond markets with yields going up, and it looked like we were on the edge of real potential calamity. And so we have this scene in the book where Lutnick and Bessent are on Air Force One with Trump. This is the Sunday before, I think it was a Tuesday or Wednesday when Trump put on the pause.
Yeah.
And they're not pleading, it probably goes too far, but they're really just urging him to just back off, to that they could see that he was pushing the car right to the edge of the cliff. And, they weren't sure where he was going to land. And it took right to the end when all the sirens were going off that Trump kind of pulled back. So it was a very frightening moment for many senior people in the government because this was just Trump behind the wheel, foot on the gas. Let's just try it.
Well, and it was to add one thing to that too, John, and I think we make this clear in the book that yes, he has been talking about tariffs for the majority of his adult life, if not his entire adult life. He has not been it wasn't backed by an economic theory. It was the idea that tariffs are, the world is the rest of the globe is ripping off America, and tariffs are an equalizer because they're a weapon, they're a way to force change from other countries. But, to Jonathan's point about the formula and Trump having no idea what he was going to do, this was something he wanted to try, but it was not rooted. I mean, I know I feel like I'm saying I'm a broken record here, but it was not rooted in some kind of a global economic theory about trade balances. It was, and imbalances. It was the rest of the world is screwing with us. We're going to screw back. Let's see what happens. And the only person who did not look close to terrified during the lead up to the pause, which was April 9th, and I was at the White House for several days leading up to the pause, was the president. But most of his aides were pretty ashen because they were aware of how close this came.
And so that leads to a backing off, which leads to, I think it was Robert Armstrong in the FT describing what happened as the taco trade. Trump always chickens out. That had to piss Trump off like 8,000%. But he did, in fact, stand down. I guess the question is, how influential are the markets in sort of quickly altering Trump's behavior or Trump's policy initiatives?
It's not zero. It's not black and white. It's a bit nuanced, but less reactive than in the first term, where he was hyper reactive to not just markets, but also domestic politics, polls, there were all kinds of domestic shock collars that are just weakened now. It's not that they don't exist at all. He still cares, as you're seeing right now with Iran, he still obviously cares about the oil price and the markets. There's no question. But in this case with Liberation Day, it's a good example. In term one, when the Dow plummets, you'd see him kind of reverse. It actually took almost us to have a bond market meltdown that forced him to pull back. So again, it's not zero, but it's less.
One thing that's fascinated me about the Trump administration is if you go back to the end of the first term and you look at what happened thereafter, he was banned from Facebook, he was banned from Twitter, he was, I can't imagine that he did anything but despise the big tech folk in Silicon Valley. And lo and behold, by the time that the second term begins, big tech has more influence, it seems to me, than any single, quote, interest group, end quote, around. What accounts for that? Is it just money, or is it that they offered a path to more power, I guess?
It's a combination of factors, and Jonathan should answer this too. But in the case of, say, Mark Zuckerberg, this was somebody who had funded a pro-immigration group for many, many years that was pretty antagonistic toward Trump. He's not involved in that group as far as we know anymore. He also did not like a lot of the policies around DEI that the Biden administration favored and supported. He was pretty clear about that in a meeting, a pretty remarkable meeting that we wrote about between himself and Stephen Miller and some other folks down at Mar-a-Lago during the transition. Yes, Zuckerberg has interests that he needed to solve, but for Trump, there was a personalist aspect to it with folks like Zuckerberg, which was that he was deplatformed, to your point earlier, after he left office in disgrace in 2021. And these folks were restoring him, and they were restoring him with financial tributes too. It was, donations to super PACs. Or, in the case of Elon Musk, certainly during the summer of 2024, Musk spent a ton of money to try to help Trump. The idea of these folks groveling to Trump at the social media tech firms was very appealing to him. In terms of AI, Trump had a pretty deep conversion. We have this incredible scene in the book in 2024 in the summer where he's meeting with two of the OpenAI top brass, and Sam Altman couldn't make the meeting because he was sick, but they're showing him how it works. And Trump expresses this concern. What if somebody fakes my voice about launching a nuke, right? Or a nuke is coming at the US, I forget the specific. But, he was having pretty reasonable concerns, but it has completely transformed into, Trump is like the biggest, shit poster of AI slop, excuse my language, from a prominent perch. I mean, he posts that stuff a lot. And in that case, it was some combination of sort of being wowed by the tech, but also obviously, donations and interest, or, the possibility of. And then there's the chips aspect, which is in Trump's mind about dominance over China. And so there's not one single reason, but he has, in many cases, done things like with Intel reaching into corporate boardrooms that we just wouldn't see outside of an emergency situation. Jonathan may have a smarter thought than I do about that.
No, look, I think it's a couple of things. Firstly, I also think it's not very deeply rooted, and you're seeing that right now with their 180 on AI policy. Seems to be the start of a 180 on, actually, we need to start thinking about risk management with some of these models, which was not their posture at all last year. And he doesn't really have many people on his senior team who know anything about AI anymore. So that's another issue. But Trump understands attention. And what you saw on the dais at his inauguration was, someone described it as this way, so I'm stealing someone's phrase, but it was sort of the lords of the attentional universe, right? You had
good line.
You had the great masters of the attentional universe, Google, Facebook, Apple, X. And Trump gets that. Of course, someone whose whole life, one of, besides amassing wealth, has been about amassing fame and amassing attention and amassing influence. And, if there's something he understands at, a sort of cellular level, it's that. So I think that's part of it. And if he knew during the first term that these people could become boosters and allies, he would have leapt at that. But they were in a hostile posture throughout the first term. And once they started genuflecting in the latter half of 2024, he welcomed it. I mean, we have he bragged about it. I mean, we have a scene in our book of Trump at his golf club in Doral showing off for guests text messages from Zuckerberg and Bezos. Look at this. Basically, they, quote unquote, they're kissing my ass. And, a letter from Zuckerberg's child that was very flattering. So this is what he was doing. He was showing it off. And, what a flex, right? The richest, most powerful men in the world running the most powerful companies in the world that account for an inordinate amount of the stock market. Of course, Trump didn't even know. Trump had no idea who Jensen Huang was or what NVIDIA was. NVIDIA was until the second term. I mean, he used to say, who's this Jensen? What's this Jensen thing? And then Jensen Huang, Trump suddenly realizes he's quote unquote hot. And then, Trump himself becomes a shareholder in NVIDIA, and he's checking, each time you look at the market cap, it's, add an extra trillion. So there's a sense of just awe at the sheer sums of money involved. And there's another aspect to it, which is during his first term, Trump was still very wedded to this idea of bringing back heavy industry.
Yes.
to America.
Yeah.
The sort of coal mines and that kind of thing was his vision. I think Trump realized by the second term that's not really happening. And
although he won't say
he
that.
He won't
Yes,
articulate that, but he's
Yeah.
the coal industry is not going to be what it once was. But what AI and these companies are promising is capital expenditure on just a plane that is almost unimaginable. And so Trump can see, obviously, that this is a way to reindustrialize America, give him huge investments coming into the country, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an obvious winner for him if you come from his point of view.
Yeah, the shift, the beginning of a shift on AI, I thought was perfectly captured by Sam Altman offering Trump 5% of AI. I guess the U.S. government 5% of AI, although I'm not sure about that. But the argument of the AI community has always been, if we don't get there first, China will.
Right.
Therefore, we have to, keep the horses out of the barn, and we should never even think about putting the horse back in the barn, because otherwise China will get first and we won't, and that'll be the end of the United States in some way. This is not an argument that is resonating with what is called the MAGA movement. And a big part of the MAGA movement is white evangelical Christians who see big tech almost uniformly as a menace. Given that split, I'm curious because I saw an interview with Steve Bannon in which he said 90% of the MAGA movement is opposed to big tech. The Trump the Trump White House is completely off message, etc. How much of the pushback from the quote MAGA movement end quote has made a difference or had an impact on the Trump White House?
They're certainly aware of it, but John, there's nothing in our reporting that has so far that has suggested, and maybe that'll change, that's why. Our understanding is actually that a lot of it is coming from Scott Bessent, among the Treasury Secretary, but also, obvious concerns about hacking and cybersecurity that I think just weren't necessarily anticipated. And it wasn't anticipated what the models may be capable of doing. I have no doubt that there are people who are in Trump's ear directly talking about this. And I do know that the White House is aware of these kinds of concerns from folks like Bannon. But I don't believe that, again, and maybe there'll be something that we turn up in our reporting going forward that suggests otherwise, but I don't believe that is the driver. I think, if anything, they are seeing the split over AI less significant as a threat to their coalition than other. And I'll actually give you a perfect example as to why. So we got hold of private polling memos and focus group memos that Trump's top pollster, Tony Fabrizio, conducted over the course of the last year and a half. And one, I should say the 14-month period we were writing about, and one related to affordability, which was in December of last year. But the other was summarizing 2 days of focus groups that were done in March, one of which overlapped with the day that we were in the Oval Office. And it's pretty clear that the Jeffrey Epstein saga and crisis and ongoing questions about what might still be in the unreleased material, voters were bringing that up proactively. And it wasn't just, hardcore MAGA folks. It was various folks, according to the memo that Fabrizio wrote up. And it outweighed serious issues for these voters, like crime and safety, like data centers. So I don't think that this is the huge engine that Bannon, who no doubt will light me up on his show for saying this, believes it is. In terms of the White House, I do believe it is with some aspects of the MAGA base, but I don't think that's why the White House is doing what it's doing.
I wanted to ask the question of, the presidency, you have the formal advisors, and then you have the people who sort of you talk to at night or talk to over the weekend. Who are the most influential outside voices or outside friends who are on the phone with Trump? And I'm curious as to who they are before we get to the greatest scene ever, which is Epstein in the Situation Room.
Well, one of them is, we just mentioned him earlier, Boris Epstein. Trump talks to him all the time. It's sometimes hard to trace his influence and involvement because he's very secretive in the way he operates, but he has his hands in all kinds of things. He was, for example, an intermediary, which we document in the book, in dealing with the law firms when Trump was trying to get these huge pro bono commitments out of law firms that employed or represented people that he considered enemies. Boris Epstein was in those meetings, negotiating on Trump's behalf. So he's one. And then I think it's sort of issue specific. So, for example, on the lead up to the Iran war, Trump was, I think pretty much everyone in his inner circle will tell you that Mark Levin, the conservative host, had a significant sway on his thinking. Very hawkish, pro-Israel voice. Mark Thiessen as well, actually, who writes columns for the Washington Post. Jack Keane, who's a former general that you see on television. So there's people like that on Iran that have had a significant say. And then it's less clear because, a lot of it is sort of his interactions are, he'll be on the Mar-a-Lago patio at night with his iPad playing Pavarotti and James Brown, and people will wander over to the table, have a little chat. He'll play golf with someone. He hears from a lot of business people and what have you. And so he's very easy just to get to directly. So it's actually sometimes quite hard to trace a lot of his conversations because they're not going through intermediaries. They're just people calling Trump. And there's a lot of it.
One person who used to have a fair amount of influence I was just thinking about the Senate and lawmakers before he went into the government, or at least had frequent interactions with the president really liked him, was Mark Wayne Mullen. And I wonder about what that ends up looking like now that Mullen is at DHS and leading an agency that Stephen Miller considers to be pretty broken. And is now being led by somebody who has direct access to Trump in a way that Kristi Noem just never did. But it's like what Jonathan said, it really does depend on the issue. I am struck, though, at things like, Trump having, his, whatever he described, my pool guy as doing the reflecting pool or reflecting whatever the hell we call it now. I can't even remember. He's used so many different terms for it near the Lincoln Memorial. He's more open about the fact that his inputs are much more personalist and not governmental than he was in term one, even though some of them were the same.
I mean, the subject of Jeffrey Epstein is one that, as you point out, it's something that voters proactively bring up. It comes up at dinner parties. It comes up at lunch counters. It has remarkable staying power. On the other hand, if you're an advisor to the President of the United States and you're going to walk into the Oval Office and say, let's talk about Epstein, you're probably buying yourself a one-way ticket out of the Trump administration. So you have this wonderful scene in the book where a Epstein meeting is held, how to deal with the Epstein problem, but it's held in the Situation Room. Can you describe that meeting for the listeners?
There's a handful of meetings that we focused on. There's 3 in particular that were large in the Situation Room. And as you say, there were many that were held during this period of time in which Donald Trump just wanted Epstein to go away. And anybody, as we write in the book, who was bringing it up was getting snapped at or ignored. And so, to your point, they knew this was not a winning track to have conversations with him on. But it couldn't go away because there was a clamor for much more information, because there was a widespread feeling in the administration that Pam Bondi had committed a huge error by appearing to confirm there was a client list sitting on her desk in an interview in February of 2025. So all of this and efforts to tamp it down didn't work. There were a series of these Epstein crisis comms meetings by the top levels of the government in this room that is incredibly private, that is usually used for monitoring wars or for national security. One in particular that we wrote about was in August of last year. And this really is evocative of why every path these aides had. And to be clear, I'm not saying, this is not a poor them tale, just describing that the situation they were in. They had built a beta version of a website. So they're under subpoena in the House by then. They were going to put everything Jeffrey Epstein related out, civil cases, of which there are many, DOJ related material. That was the initial plan. Before one of these other large meetings in the Situation Room, one of the aides had just entered Trump's name, and up popped this secondhand, unverified allegation that was already public, by the way. It had been unsealed in an unrelated civil case a year and a half earlier, that Trump had abused some woman's nipples, that he had a nipple fetish and like to flick and suck this woman's nipples, and I'm quoting from the document, and they looked swollen and painful to this other person who relayed this. So this Trump person says in this meeting, this is out there. This is, this is there. And J.D. Vance, who along with Dan Bongino were the most vocal about just transparency, Vance actually wanted to release all of the unverified stuff, including about Trump. And he says that he doesn't think the president would mind. He's been accused of worse. And Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, pretty quickly said, actually, no, he would mind having this put on its website. And so then that's the end of the website conversation. And that's the end of trying to do something that was proactive. One of the participants told us it was just surreal to be describing, nipples in the Situation Room. We really couldn't think of any kind of an analog or find any kind of an analog. And we checked historically. So this was just, I don't know how else to describe it. It is, I would urge people to read this reporting because it speaks to so much about not just how, rooms in the White House are used and who's making decisions, but how that was the moment where Trump really started losing altitude with his own base. And you could see it, and it really paralyzed them, unlike anything since the Mueller investigation had.
We have to talk about the big one, which is the war. And you described the lead up to the war. And the thing that's astonishing about the reporting, and the reporting throughout the book is astonishing, but it's I guess Trump would call it his gut guiding the decision-making process. You have people, you describe General Kane as being as non-opinionated as he possibly can be, but clearly he thinks this is not a good idea. J.D. Vance doesn't think it's a good idea. Mark Rubio doesn't think it's a good idea. And boom, Trump says, let's go. When you did the reporting on this, was it just, were they or the people who know them as surprised by Trump's decision-making on this as we were?
Well, Trump is always, there's a sort of an element of not seeing what's in front of you with Trump on Iran.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of the people in this sort of anti-interventionist, isolationist camp who have refused to see that Trump has always been more hawkish about Iran than they have. During the first term, a number of his advisors counseled him to stay in the Obama nuclear deal. He pulled out. There were several people around him who thought it was risky and a bad idea to kill Qasem Soleimani. He obviously went ahead with that. And then, from Trump's point of view, the world didn't collapse. During the interregnum period, he was briefed by the FBI that Iran was trying to kill him, that they'd hired kill teams inside the United States. So, that probably had a personal effect on him. We have some reporting in the book that Netanyahu's top advisor, Ron Dermer, visited with Trump after the election and came away from that meeting telling associates that he thought there was an 80% chance that Trump would join Israel in a war against Iran. So he came away very much of the view that Trump was willing to act more aggressively in a second term. There's a little bit of Trump tells different people different things and what they want to hear. So through the early administration, he was definitely telling people like Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk, I'm not going to get dragged into this war. Bibi's, a disaster. He described Netanyahu as a con man, direct quote, con man to some of his aides at different times. He's obviously had a fraught relationship with Netanyahu. But I think that the combination of the 12-day war last year, which Trump saw as a spectacular success, and it concluded with Iran very tepidly firing off a pretty small number of missiles that didn't kill any Americans. I think Trump concluded that the regime was not all they were hyped up to be, that this was a paper tiger regime. Netanyahu could be very persuasive. He was very aggressive and relentless in pushing for this. And we have a scene where he comes down to the White House Situation Room and gives Trump a presentation about regime change scenarios. But, Trump the idea that this was sort of Netanyahu puppeteering Trump, it just doesn't comport with our reporting at all. Trump had a gut instinct that this regime was going to fall, that he was going to be the president to deal with this problem once and for all after 47 years of US policy failure. And despite what the CIA director John Ratcliffe told him about the implausibility of Netanyahu's regime change scenarios, despite what Rubio said, despite the risks that were raised to him by Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Trump just felt what he felt. He felt that this was going to go the way that it was going to be a quick war and that none of these problems would happen, the closure of the strait or the munitions issues, because the war would be over before any of that happened. Obviously was a major miscalculation, but it was, again, Trump gut-driven decision-making. And I think there's one other thing that we draw out in our reporting that's really important to understand, which is even though you can't actually find anyone in his inner circle who thought that this war was a good idea. I mean, the closest you'll find is Pete Hegseth, but basically all of them were skeptical. The only one who really vocally made a case against the war to Trump in the room was the vice president. And it cost him with Trump. It irritated Trump. Trump he didn't want to hear it. But others really kind of either kept their concerns to themselves or delivered them in such a neutral and diluted way, like Dan Kane, that Trump didn't really hear them as concerns. He just sort of saw it as, on the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. And that's how it happened.
I have one last question before we let Maggie go and you go, Jonathan, which is people marvel at Trump's energy and stamina and just keep on plowing along. And pretty much the same people are concerned about his health. They think he looks terrible. They think he's getting more forgetful. And you're reporting, how do you square that circle of this incredible energy and stamina with a person in his 80s who is clearly, if you look at film from 2016 and compare it to today, it's almost like two different people. How do you square that circle? What do your sources tell you?
Yeah, I mean, so his health is not an area of success. It is the most closed off black box in his world. Has been for decades. His former doctor, Harold Bornstein, who has since passed away, but told a story to the New York Times' Larry Altman about how Trump aides came and just absconded with his files when the president was elected the first time. He does not like people knowing about his health, by the way, which doesn't mean that there is something there. He's just incredibly closed about it. And he sees health-related issues and illness and disease as signs of weakness or indicators of weakness. I do think two things can be true at once. We all can see the ankles thing, although I don't think I've seen his ankles lately, the chronic venous insufficiency, the bruising on the hands, that their explanation, I don't entirely understand how that is handshaking and people scratching him. He's 80. He has clearly slowed down in terms of how he speaks. I mean, as you said, I can look at the same videos you do. And then I can look at them from 30 years ago, and his speech is even crisper there. So I don't know whether it is something beyond that, and it may not be. But there's a reason that there have been very few 80-year-olds who are president of the U.S., and it's because they tend not to be as spry as they once were. That said, he is doing these foreign trips with these insanely compressed time frames. He had some screw ups when he was talking that were obvious. I forget what he said, but he called Iran Japan and
right.
Zelensky
Putin.
Was
clearly fatigued.
Right. And so he's tired, but that he wouldn't be the first president in the world who had that either. I don't know what we don't know. But what we do know is he's 80 and he's clearly not in tip-top shape. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have significant stores of energy. And I guess the only other thing I would say, John, is that this comes up often, over and over again about the comparison to Biden and coverage of Biden's health. Well, I mean, we see Trump much more than we saw Biden. We just do in terms of the day-to-day. And that is a factor too, and I think how people make these assessments, just as viewers.
That really comes through in the book, that Trump, is engaged and he's not Biden at all. He's in those meetings. He's traveling all the time. He's, as you say, transparent, almost to a fault. I mean, Biden did
in some ways, but yeah, in some ways,
right. But I mean, he's available to.
Yeah,
he's doing press
right.
gaggles all the time, and so. But anyway, taken more than enough of your time. And I appreciate you doing it. For the listeners. Again, the book is Regime Change, authored by our guests, Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan. It tells the story of inside the imperial presidency of Donald Trump. I urge you to buy not one copy, but two. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for having us, John.
Thanks for having us, John.